So this is part 3 of my commentary and reflection on the Platonic dialogue Parmenides. So we finished off last time discussing the forms, and discussing the difference between the forms and the particulars. The difference here being that in the sense of the particulars, we have something that is incomplete. We have something that is of a mixture. Something that is not unified, though unity can exist within that mixture. It is unlike the forms in the sense that it is not a pure unity. The forms are something that we would call intelligible. The knowable. And in the particulars, we may call this the sensible. Now we're in the middle of this rather frustrating, maybe not dilemma, but problem. And it's mostly frustrating because we've been exposed to the sophist and the statesman, which provide a potential solution to the disunification that we see between the underlying structure that the theory of the forms wishes to propose and the particulars. Now, we know that, of course, there has to be a relation between the two. But for the forms to be so in themselves, for their own sake, is a seeming contradiction. And so, in my mind at least, there is this budding contrary experience when I'm going through this, because we're not where the sophist was in that dialogue. It's a later Platonic dialogue. So we've come to this discussion now of talking about a particular form, and it is that of knowledge. Now, as far as knowledge is concerned, as far as the human being is concerned, we have imperfect knowledge. We gather our information as best we can, and we come to conclusions. We come to some opinion about things. But in the formal domain, in the intelligible domain, that which is knowledge is known by itself. That is the object of knowledge. So I want to read here. Parmenides says, "But, as you agree, we neither have the forms themselves, nor can they belong to us. And surely the kinds themselves, what each of them is, are known by the form of knowledge itself." Now, up until this point, I've made this effort to try not to attribute agency to the formal domain, and I don't necessarily think that we should. We're doing a reasonable or rational exercise into the domain of the forms. While we may have agentic discussions and the discussions about the divine that are related to this, it would seem that it would bring in an unnecessary dilemma for which we would struggle to work our way through. And this is something that I don't necessarily wish to get too strongly into, but since it is mentioned here, I think it's worth at least considering. For if there's to be a form of knowledge, and if something is to be known, that is an action. It requires an agent. We could say that, well, unlike knowledge and knowing, something like a chair or a table that may have a formal objective description. To know something is entirely a different matter. The information that is contained within knowing as opposed to knowledge again implies agency. Again, he says, and surely kinds themselves, what each of them is, are known by the form of knowledge itself. So we're going to put this in our back pocket. The potential for agency to work its way through the forms. As it works its way through the forms, it necessarily finds us. If each of the particulars is to be known by the form of knowledge, the purity of knowledge, the object of knowledge, and there's going to be direction to it. And if we are to be those beings that participate within the domain of the intelligible, then of course we would necessarily come into contact with whatever agency this is, whatever directionality is associated with it. We would, by extension, participate in that thing. And surely the kinds themselves, what each of them is, are known by the form of knowledge itself. The very thing that we don't have. Now, the reason that he says this, the very thing that we don't have, is because the formal domain, the intelligible domain, is something that we see and something that we participate in. It's an aspect of reality, let's say, that doesn't have anything to do with material causes. It doesn't have anything to do with owning. It just is. It is about being itself. So none of the forms, Parmenides continues, is known by us, because we don't partake of knowledge itself. Now this is another example of this rather frustrating series of propositions by Parmenides, that because we lack this strong relationality to or between the sensible domain and the formal domain, there is this disagreement in the sense that we are unable to know the forms in the purest sense. And again, the reason for that is because the forms are of themselves by themselves. But by the same token, we say that we participate in them. And if by extension we participate in them, of course there is some way in which we understand them. And we don't need to go very far to understand how we understand them. The chair and the table, the classic example. While there are many different types of tables, many different types of chairs, at some point we no longer recognize something as a chair or a table. And there's such variability that can exist, I think, between the form and the particular, because almost anything can be a table as long as it fulfills its purpose. We can go outside and be absolutely destitute of modern production and industrial goods and find a sufficient place to sit down and rest our food, and we can eat it upon that surface because it is convenient, it is raised, we don't have to hunch over, and we can call it a table because it fits that purpose. But the question then is, well, how does it participate in this form? Well, probably it participates by its purpose. Surely what's built around our conception of what a table or what a chair is vast and variable. But it may not necessarily be all of what the form is. And it would seem more practical to say that of the truth of the unified form that we can see is of its I want to say participatory, but that's not the whole of it. It's of our ability to participate with that thing that serves a particular purpose. Now, the purpose that a chair serves is to have whatever agent requires rest or sitting to, I suppose, be satisfied by that, to sit in it. Sometimes I wonder how off track I am with regard to these forms. And sometimes I wonder at the utility of this. And I don't doubt that there is utility. But at times, given uncertainty, the uncertainty can plague. It can tempt away from productive reasonings. So I'd like to spend some time and maybe reiterate a couple of things. I sit in a rather interesting chair. The design is interesting, I suppose. It's a nice cushioned chair. The armrest has a nice little cushion on it. The wood has an unfortunate worn quality to it that was produced by the manufacturer, and I couldn't quite see it in the picture when I ordered it, but it's a nice chair nonetheless. It's nice wood and everything, and has an interesting aesthetic. There are these sort of intermingling spheres that form its backrest and the arm and the legs. And it gives it an interesting farmhouse type aesthetic. Plenty of chairs don't have this aesthetic. I come back to this idea of purpose and how important it is when considering our participation in something. From the agent's perspective, how we choose to relate to things depends much on the purpose behind that relating. If we need some place to sit because we are tired, we need a chair. And language aside, I suppose we can say that there is a form of it. But with regard to the forms, animals, many of them, don't need chairs. The idea of a chair, again, regardless of language, is foreign to them. And so when we say, or that when we can identify some intelligible thing that is a form, and we say the form of a chair, it would seem to be particular to the mind, or to the necessity of the agent in question. And while I don't think it's necessary to restrict the form and the structures of those forms to the mind, I do think that there are forms that the mind can consider and see because of its own participation with reality, let's say. But I wouldn't want to be too insular, because it seems as though if we expand this analogy out a little bit back to the animals, And we just take mammals, for example. I see my cat hopping down the stairs now, and he's walking over to me. I'm guessing that he's going to jump up on my lap at some point. But as I watch him, I understand that where he lays his head to rest is in some sense a bed. If we push this analogy of the chair a little bit, he chooses to sit in particular places. Sometimes I think that they have an important purpose. Many times when he's resting, he'll rest on a carpet rather than the hardwood floor. His place of sleeping is near me. It's on a softer surface. And so there are these preferences that seem to be universal among beings that we are familiar with. And I think we can ascribe to these similarities forms, or what we perceive to be forms. And they are, in their extension, a type of unification, as we've been discussing. The perfect completeness of them, again, I question. And I question it because the particular agent that participates with it may be the only one that requires it. And is it the case that if it is the only one that requires it, that it is something entirely made up by the agent in question? I'm not sure, but I think that the broader point here is that what emerges is not so much a better idea of the form of the chair, but rather this thought that what we might see as a form in our eyes, the perfection of a chair, let's say, which might involve beauty, it might involve comfortability, it might involve a particular size, and surely, of course, the most important element, which is its functional capacity to achieve the purpose of the desire of that which relates to it. And I guess, again, that matters more so in our capacity, but there are many things that relate to one another that have some sort of, that their relationship is maintained because of certain affordances and sacrifices and all the rest. And by these participations and the purposes that arise from them, there is this unification of something. We can see it when it comes to preference in terms of agentic beings, like the cat that purrs in my lap, or the person that's talking into this microphone. And so while we haven't really broached this topic, I think that there is this strong relatedness that uses the formal structure that we just have not yet gotten to. So again, Parmenides says, so none of the forms is known by us because we don't partake of knowledge itself. Then the beautiful itself, what it is, cannot be known by us, nor can the good, nor indeed can any of the things we take to be characters themselves. Now, of course, we've established already that it's possible to see something good or to see something beautiful because we have the names that are based on more fundamental and more pure concepts of these things. But again, there's a deeper layer here. If we restrict our minds to ourselves, then it seems like we become as insular as Parmenides' argument about the forms being entirely of themselves for themselves, and that leads to these assertions like we don't participate in knowledge, or we don't know knowledge itself, or we don't know beauty itself, etc. He says, here's something even more shocking than that. Socrates responds, what's that? Surely you would say that if in fact there is knowledge, a kind itself, it is much more precise than is knowledge that belongs to us. So of course now when he says kind, he's referring to form, and the knowledge that belongs to us would be the knowledge of particular, or the knowledge within the sensible order. And the same goes for beauty and all the others. Yes, says Socrates. Well, whatever else partakes in knowledge itself, wouldn't you say that God, more than anyone else, has this most precise knowledge? Okay, so here we are. We've entered into the divine and agentic domain all at once. And so we have an agent that serves as a bridge that occupies both domains, the sensible order and the intelligible order. And I say this because, well, on one hand we have a sensible character, something that has a bit of mixture, something that is infinite in its mixture, but also infinite in itself, in its unification. That assertion, I think, also would need some describing. Now, it would be necessary if we come to it in a moment, but I'll leave that as it is for now. I think it's sufficient to have, or to say, that a God, no matter where it is on that scale of unification, possesses a unique relationship between the sensible order and what we've been calling the intelligible order, or the order of forms. Now, Socrates responds necessarily, and Parmenides continues, tell me, will God, having knowledge itself, then be able to know things that belong to our world? Now, this is something that I just assumed. It would be natural if a God participates with the forms and understands the forms as they are, for the sake of themselves. It would seem that a step down from this would not be an unreasonable task, or perhaps it's by matter of participation that we see this, that I see this incorrectly. Parmenides says, because we have agreed, Socrates, that those forms do not have their power in relation to things in our world, and things in our world do not have theirs in relation to forms, but that things in each group have their power in relation to themselves. So again, that those forms do not have their power in relation to things in our world. This we have firmly established and understand. That these intelligible forms, or these structures, are not based in a causal structure. They are of themselves an order of the intellect. And so they relate only to themselves, to other forms. They are simple, they are pure, they are identical. They are not affected, they are ground. Unlike us, we are caused, affected, influenced. Now, their power, we've talked about this before, but I have to imagine that the power that they possess is it's not agentic. We can't describe it in those terms, but they do have a way in which they participate with being. They form the substructure to cause the capacity for being to exist, I suppose. And being here is not just agentic conscious experience. It is something that is. That would be the most foundational form of being. And the forms, of course, are that, but they are also those things that are like the structural supports in a house, that they are there in order to hold it up. So while they themselves are being, they also facilitate being. But they facilitate a particular order of being. He says, and things in our world do not have theirs in relation to forms. So our power is again by the causal. It is by the relational among things that are mixed, that are imperfect. Of course, we understand that in the human sense, our power is much derived based on motion, capacity, and purpose. He says, but that things in each group have their power in relation to themselves. Yes, we did agree on that, says Socrates. Well then, if this most precise mastery is the most precise knowledge, and this most precise knowledge belonged to the divine, the gods' mastery could never master us, nor could their knowledge know us or anything that belongs to us. So of course this can't be true. The most precise mastery. By mastery, I think command. I think not necessarily power, but power can be an element of this. Command in terms of utilization, and I think this comes down to purpose as well. When we have strong command over something, we can better fulfill a particular purpose. We can solve problems more effectively. And as a god on a smaller scale, let's say, if we can use those terms, if they are to participate with these forms and no being that is unified and be able to handle maintaining that unity, despite, again, this is where it rubs up against my belief wrongly, that the gods have a particular type of perfection, a particular type of order that allows them to partake and to participate with the forms such that the unity of themselves and the forms is not disrupted. But with all things, we can say that there's a unity. We can say that there is some agent. I look around my living room and I see so many different objects, so many different things that have boundaries and unique characteristics that are separated from one another. Of course, this is a spatial consideration, and the forms do not operate in that way. But all the same, we can draw some parallel, at least, in this way. If this most precise mastery and this most precise knowledge belong to the divine, the gods' mastery could never master us, nor could their knowledge know us, or anything that belongs to us. Now, I wish that there was a much more detailed description of this. I wish there was a discussion on the definition of what a god is. I wish there was a discussion on what this sort of agentic space would look like for some agentic being to exist within the intelligible order, separate from the sensible order. I think that there are some inconsistencies here, because we just haven't drawn these conclusions very well yet. Nor could their knowledge know us, or anything that belongs to us. No, just as we do not govern them by our governance, and know nothing of the divine by our knowledge, so they in turn are, for the same reasons, neither our masters, nor, being gods, do they know human affairs. So it's an interesting thing to consider, especially with regard to an atheistic view or an agnostic view. Maybe even not that, but even a believer, I think, has an interesting perspective. There's all interesting perspectives approaching this. What I find most interesting is that despite where we are, there is still an assumed divinity. Again, no, just as we do not govern them by our governance, and know nothing of the divine by our knowledge. This term of expression is interesting. If we are to know nothing of the divine by our knowledge, then how do we know the divine to be? How do we know it to exist? And perhaps this contradiction is on purpose. Parmenides may be saying this to pick apart Socrates' argument for the sake of reducing. And in the sake of reducing, we find these inconsistencies and these errors, and we have to change and move forward from there. Okay, so today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So I want to tackle this matter that at the first instance seems to be perhaps something of a a dilemma between the believing mind, the committed mind, and potentially the unbelieving. And I say this because as mentioned, I find it odd to go on this line of reasoning, although I understand, and given what I just said yesterday evening about this reduction in the argument of Socrates and following things to their logical conclusions is necessary, I find it odd that what appears to be a path leading us to the absence of some divine, at least the absence of some divine's influence in our experience, and our participation in reality. And as I mentioned yesterday, the thing that I truly find odd is that there's this preconception that despite there being this separation, hypothetical separation between the forms and the particulars, there still happens to be the room for this divine being. And I suppose the reason that I bring up this potential atheism is because if something is so devoid of our experience, even if one is to believe that it is to be there, it's hard to make a connection if there's no relation among these things. And yet we're claiming, or perhaps we're not claiming yet, but it seems to be obvious that there has to be some participation in the forms on the part of the sensible order for them to be. Then without this appropriate relation, it seems like there's a disheartening, at least in my experience. And while this may not necessarily mean an atheism or an agnosticism, it certainly raises question about the place of the divine if we were to stop here. The separation is, in me, inherently dissatisfying. I sort of hunger for this unification between the formal order and the sensible order. So I'm going to begin again with this paragraph. Well then, if this most precise mastery and this most precise knowledge belong to the divine, the gods, mastery could never find us, nor could their knowledge know us or anything that belongs to us. And that's because of this inseparable, or this separable block between the two. Surely inconsistent, because we know that there's a relation if we are to imagine ourselves in some likeness or in some sense a mirror of those more pure and stable forms or patterns. No, he says, just as we do not govern them by our governance and know nothing of the divine by our knowledge. So this is interesting. You know, the divine, the discussion of the divine is always maybe not a chaotic one, but it's challenging at the very least. What we are after is some solid grounding for goodness, some direction and some order to reality that's outside of ourselves. And of course there are plenty of patterns out there. The ones that are meaningful and translate to human experience that seem to have this transcendent quality are difficult to identify, difficult to rationalize, and have in the mind concretely, and to have as sort of evidence in one's pocket, evidence for a strong faith that no matter what happens, we ourselves have experienced something that we know is much greater, and it gives us strength. And here, this idea that we know nothing of the governance of the divine, I'm not sure I have much thought to it, rather than a feeling, a wondering, because still at the bottom of this there is an axiom or something preconceived, a preconceived belief that there are these divinities, these divine agents. And rather than say, because we know nothing of these things and therefore they do not exist. He admits of their existence and of their governances, but says they are separate from ours. It seems a foolish argument to make. Again, no, just as we do not govern them by our governance, and know nothing of the divine by our knowledge, so they in turn are, for the same reason, neither our masters, nor, being gods, do they know human affairs. If God is to be stripped of knowing, he said, our argument may be getting too bizarre. This is exactly my sentiment. And when he says stripped of knowing, of course, we're not. The initial argument is not a complete stripping of knowing. The knowing of gods, or of God, is within the formal domain in Parmenides' argument. And yet, Socrates, said Parmenides, the forms inevitably involve these objections and a host of others besides. If there are those characters for things, and a person is to mark off each form as something itself. So here again we see the idea of a person marking off each form as something itself. Now by this I think he means that the form is isolated. It's an isolated structure. It doesn't participate in anything of the sensible, except it participates with those other things that are of the formal domain. And we see this word again, characters, if there are those characters for things. Now the definition of a character, number one, the mental and moral qualities distinctive to an individual. The distinctive nature of something. The quality of being individual in an interesting or unusual way. Strength and originality. So there's this point of origin and this identifiable place of thingness. A degree of separation, but separation to the extent that there is something there that is identified. So the forms inevitably involve these objections. If there are those characters for things, now the vagueness, I like that there is this space, but it can be frustrating at times. Now I maintain what I said before. Now these things, we can identify anything we want. I mentioned a moment ago that of the chair and of the table. There are a few around me here. I have a few different types of tables. I have what would you call this? It's not a dining room table, an end table, and then a lounge table, I guess. It's a shorter table. It has a little storage place underneath it. So two different types of tables. They're still both tables. I see across from me a dining room table. Different purposes. They fulfill different purposes, but there is a unified purpose that makes them all tables. Whereas this end table, it's supporting my laptop. It maybe supports a drink or a lamp. This living room table, it is something that maybe stores a snack or two. I'm able to rest my feet upon it. And the dining room table is more of a cultural symbol. It's where I go to eat. It is where people come together to eat. So if I'm going to have an issue with the fact that the objections that Parmenides raises, that of the separation between the formal domain and the sensible, the separation of the divine relegated to the formal order and completely divested and uninvolved in the sensible, then we have to take also objection to the something itself, each form as something itself argument. And of course, we've been through this already after having gone through the sophist, and there's a sort of a pluralistic argument, but there's something even more sophisticated there, I think, because it's not a matter of just purely recognizing that multiplicity exists, that beginnings and endings exist, that unifications exist. It's the fact that there is, perhaps it's a desire, perhaps it's something known. If I say this, perhaps that it's, in my mind, it's not something known yet, but I have an idea or a conception and a belief, I would say, that of the graduated nature of things that involve all of this, there is a unified center. And this unified center is not something that is simply diffused, that it has an identity and perhaps even an agency in and of itself. Now, that's not to say that there aren't diffused elements. Of course there are. Just as my let's say the furnishings of this apartment. There is this diffusal of my being in this apartment. Of course, anybody that comes into this space will know that there is somebody that is responsible for the ordering of the structure of the environment. Of course, there's layers to this because there's an underlying structure. That underlying structure is the building itself, the materials that go up to make the rooms and all of this sort of thing. And that involves another layer of this abstraction. And for the divine, I think I have to imagine something that permeates all of these layers in a consistent manner. I don't want to get too far into this, but I say this because we have to go into a place that is challenging, that is pluralistic to a degree, that can seem quite chaotic, to get away from the form as something itself, by itself, and only for itself, relating only to other forms and not to man at all. It would make the entire enterprise completely useless because we wouldn't participate in it. So what use is it to have this sort of structure? As a result, says Parmenides, whoever hears about them is doubtful that objects that they do and objects that they do not exist, and that even if they do, they must by strict necessity be unknowable to human nature. So I'm going to read that again. As a result, whoever hears about them is doubtful, and objects that they do not exist, and objects, that they do not exist. Now it's understandable, because why would we assent to some existence of a thing that is entirely separate from us, that is also supposed to be responsible for the in some sense, the uniqueness of us? It maintains our form, it maintains our identity, in the sense that, let's take the human being, for example. There is something that maintains me. At a certain point, it becomes something that I cannot call the human being. The purring cat in my lap, for example, is something that is outside of the form of man. If it is to be the case that, as we established, we cannot reason our way into a relationship with the forms, then there's no use in it. And again, we would have extreme doubts and object that they exist. And that even if they do, they must by strict necessity be unknowable to human nature. And in saying this, he seems to have a point. And as we said, he is extraordinarily hard to win over. Only a very gifted man can come to know that for each thing there is some kind, a being itself by itself. Now let's pause here. So this is a point that I agree with, but there's a caveat to it. Again, I want to read it. Only a very gifted man can come to know that for each thing there is some kind. So, in other words, that there is some unification. Because in this case, I think when he says thing, he's not referring to the form per se. Or maybe he is. Either way, the idea is that in one sense we have this form, and we are thinking about a particular. A particular is a mixture, it is imperfect, but it is comparable to some unified thing that we call a form. And being able to identify the form without completely separating it out to itself, to be an ischemic thing, without any sort of practical value, it does take skill. This is something that I just mentioned. And there are plenty of ways to go about this, and it's probably one of the best ways at discovering the potential divine landscape that is out there, by reconciling how a mixture can be unified in something that is stable and lasting, preserving, and independent, perhaps, of the thing itself to a degree, but only independent in the sense that it preserves itself. But it doesn't preserve to the extent that it is not related to the particular. It must be related to the particular if this thing is going to maintain the unification of the movable parts of the sensible order. Because after all, the formal domain is a structural domain. It is something that undergirds all things. Again, as a result, whoever hears about them is doubtful and objects that they do not exist, and that even if they do, they must by strict necessity be unknowable to human nature. And in saying this, he seems to have a point. And as we said, he is extraordinarily hard to win over. Only a very gifted man can come to know that for each thing there is some kind, a being by itself. But only a prodigy more remarkable still will discover that and be able to teach someone else who has sifted all these difficulties thoroughly and critically for himself. And so it seems, along with this dialogue, we're at the very beginning of understanding the practical usage of this structural framework. Socrates says, "I agree with you, Parmenides. That's very much what I think too. Yet on the other hand, Socrates," said Parmenides, "if someone having an eye on all the difficulties we have just brought up, and others of the same sort, won't allow that there are forms for things and won't mark off a form for each one, So again, that statement, won't allow that there are forms for things and won't mark off a form for each one. So surely this is a possibility. But this person, in saying that he won't allow forms for things, What does that mean? Well, in the first instance, he's denying that structural framework. But in a greater particular, I have to wonder if there is an issue as it relates to a particular problem. A problem of seeing these foundational elements. And what do I mean by this? The foundational elements in the sense that when we think about something as an impurity, we have an idea in mind, an object of particular attention, that causes it to be impure in the first place. I suppose we can call a mixture in general an impurity, but we would then call it an impurity because we know that it is mixed with many singular forms by themselves that can be considered pure because they have a unique identification, a unique character. If we are to deny the form, then we are to deny the intelligible order, and we are just to live in the sensible. But when we see ourselves just within the sensible, it's hard not to see the intelligible order. It's hard not to see the maintenance of unity within the mixtures. It's hard not to see the maintenance of the form of the feline and the cat. It's hard not to see the particular man in the form of the human being. If someone having an eye on all the difficulties we have just brought up, and others of the same sort, won't allow that there are forms for things, and won't mark off a form for each one, he won't have anywhere to turn his thought. Another interesting thing to think about, I think this is closer to where we are meant to be. He won't have anywhere to turn his thought. Now, when I go within my mind and I think about directional space, the space of mind, whatever that means, it's immediately outside of the passive domain. It's not just a sort of experience, base experience, where the heart is churning out emotions, responding to stimuli in the environment. There's a grasp, a gripping on an intentionality behind thought. And I've found myself in plenty of experiences where I've felt myself grasping, trying to find something for my mind to think about, whereas maybe the only thing that it could find is the excited expression of the heart, in which case it's not really thinking about it. Well, maybe it is thinking about it, but it's sort of this hypervigilance, and no real productive thought is happening. It remains passive. And it can be quite distracting, especially in social situations. In other instances, of course, it finds something quite salient. It picks up on it, and it maintains that salience to some coherent conclusion, or maintains it over some period for which there is a general productive outlet and experience. Or perhaps there's a combination of the two. And this I've found to be less of my experience. I'm less of a natural at just sort of letting things go and having thoughts come, and when they do, I just sort of naturally grab onto them. Sometimes this happens, of course, but it's not very often. There seems to be, in my experience, this need to remind myself that I have to be on, I have to turn the mind on. Sounds strange to say it that way, to be more active than to be passive. And it can be quite against the grain at times, but also at others beautiful. I sort of wonder at the experience of others if it's the same, or if my folly is laughable in the case of some. He won't have anywhere to turn his thought. And so I mention all of this because that experience of wanting to turn over, like the mind is an engine trying to turn over so that it finally gets moving, the belt is churning. The mind, it feels similarly. And because of the lack of structure that is afforded by this intelligible order, it seems that we are pointing to a person that is unable to perform that turnover of mind. The machine of the mind is unable to grasp anything. And this concept, I think, is foundational, because it says in us that what we grasp is the chaos of the world that is bound within some order. And this order is all about us. And we see perhaps imperfect expressions of it, but we know it to be there, we know it to emerge. And it's not necessary to understand or to see the purity of a form, because oftentimes I don't think we even know what it is. But at the very least, we can see the human being, the form of mankind. We understand that in a general sense. We say that we are in the image of God. That's the highest unifying form of agentic expression. Since he doesn't allow that for each thing there is a character that is always the same. It's exactly where we've been in line with. The character that is always the same, that is the unification of that thing. In this way, he will destroy the power of dialectic entirely. Now there's a note from the translator here. He said that it could be instead translated to discourse, or untechnically as conversation. But dialectic is we know is a process. It is a way of coming to understand not only the meaning of another person, but also the truth of something. It's a procedure that we participate in. And being and dissolving the mind into something that is unable to see unity in multiplicity is somebody that it cannot focus. It's a mind that is lost, an incoherent mind. I think in the absolute sense, it would be a bumbling mess. It wouldn't really be much of a conscious experience. There would be no structure for the self to orient on top of, and so it would fall apart. Now, there can be performative contradictions in which they would destroy the conversation. That would certainly make sense. Parmenides continues, he says, "But I think you are only too well aware of that. What you say is true," Socrates said. "What then will you do about philosophy? Where will you turn while these difficulties remain unsolved?" I don't think I have anything clearly in view, at least not at present. Socrates, That's because you are trying to mark off something beautiful and just and good. In each one of the forms, too soon, he said. Before you have properly trained. So let's take this critique to heart, because if it applies to Socrates, it surely applies to us. That there is a danger. Well, first of all, there's a comfort that I have in knowing that Socrates, as a young person, doesn't really have anything clearly in view of how to philosophize his way through this, because there is obviously something here. And he's trying to mark off each one of the forms before he has been properly trained. So Parmenides is indicating that there is some training or some method by which coming to understand the forms better will be made easier. He says, I noticed that the other day too, as I listened to you conversing with Aristotle here, the impulse you bring to argument is noble and divine. Make no mistake about it. But while you are still young, put your back into it and get more training through something people think useless. What the crowd call idle talk. Otherwise, the truth will escape you. Now this is interesting. Of course, a moment ago, we were thinking about that very thing, about how the mind, if we think too much about it, about grasping onto something, it may provoke in us a type of antagonism that works against a natural grabbing onto of the intelligible order. That our desire of seeing it is the very thing that limits us from grasping it or participating in it more fully. In this idle talk, almost another contradiction in terms, idle in the sense of this stagnation, non-moving, but of course it's a conversation, so it is moving, but it's not perhaps in the way that we are used to in this dialogue. It's not philosophical. It's basic talk. It's, maybe how's the weather. It's general introductory speech. It is getting to know somebody. It's by this ease of conversation that it seems that the mind naturally folds into the reality that it is a part of. However much the rational mind may be bored by it, I think it's a necessary component. And it happens to be the fact that I was thinking about this earlier today, in some respect. Now that I think about it, it comes into greater view. I was listening to a Baroque composer, trying to remember his name. Corelli, I think his last name is. I can't really remember. It's an interesting first name, which I can't remember either, but nonetheless, I downloaded his works today, and I listened to his sixth opus maybe 2 or 3 times through, and like with any composer, I suppose, but I'm only really familiar with 2 in any particular detail, that is Vivaldi and now this composer, who I can't remember the name of, so of course can't be that intermixed with classical music, but nonetheless, I've noticed a pattern. Some of it has to do with individual taste. I'm not somebody that is much fond of, although there are certainly many exceptions, of the major key. I tend to be a bit, I think, melancholic in an unfortunate sense. Perhaps there are some positives to it, but I'm just drawn to that minor key. And when a major one comes on, sometimes, especially in the Baroque period, it can be a bit, boring is not the right word, but it would suffice for now. A bit boring, let's say. And this boredom, I think, is necessary. Not necessarily the tired mind that becomes dejected and doesn't pay attention, but rather the mind that engages, but not engaged to the degree where it's everything is in line, so to speak. It's not like the heart is feeling on all cylinders. It's not as though the mind is considering some memory and detail that is provoked by the beauty of the music, but rather it's a playful wondering about what's happening in the music, regardless of whether or not it catches the ear. There always happens to be something within these composers that catches the ear, regardless of if it's more preferable or not, if it's major or minor in my particular sense. And I found myself listening to this, and I had a positive experience, just sort of sitting and not changing a particular aspect of a concerto or moving on to a different one, just sticking with it and listening in its entirety. And not immediately, but eventually, there becomes this sort of ease of participation with the music, regardless of whether or not it's 100% maximally enjoyable or not, whatever that means. Now Socrates says, "What manner of training is that, Parmenides?" he asked. "The manner is just what you heard from Zeno," he said, "except I was also impressed by something you had to say to him. You didn't allow him to remain among visible things and observe their wandering between opposites. You asked him to observe it instead among those things that one might above all grasp by means of reason and might think to be forms. So starting with the first here, you didn't allow him to remain among visible things. So this is interesting. The mind is such an interesting place. A bizarre and interesting place. Now I say this because if Socrates is in a place where he's not allowing his compatriot to stay in the visible, in some sense he's not allowing him to stay within the sensible order. Now he's not denying it, of course, so there is this experience. But there's this interplay between what Parmenides mentions before, between idle talk and whatever this is, philosophical discourse or philosophical dialectic, that this interplay is quite subtle. And while on the one hand, Socrates is being reproved by not engaging in the idle talk, on the other hand, he's being praised for moving outside of the sensible and moving into that space of the intelligible. You didn't allow him to remain among visible things and observe their wandering between opposites. Now, observe their wandering between opposites. This is an interesting expression because I think it implies what I have been sort of casually calling the mixture or the impurity. Casually wandering between opposites. There would be such a difficult time identifying a unifying principle if we are just going back and forth between things and don't have our mind focused on one thing. At least this is what I think about when I think about this wandering between opposites. You asked him to observe it instead of... You asked him to observe it instead among those things that one might above all grasp by means of reason and might think to be forms. So again, moving from that, the domain of the sensible and of the particular, to that of the intelligible, and perhaps that of the unseen. So I'm going to pick this up again tomorrow. Tomorrow evening. It'll be after a long day at work, so we'll see. Hopefully there's some productive thoughts that come about. I'm sure that there will be. So until then. Okay, so today happens to be a new day. As I mentioned, it's in the evening after work. And it's always a tough procedure to get the train of the mind up and running again. But nonetheless, I'm interested to continue where we left off. Now to this, Socrates responds, "I did that," he said, "because I think that here, among visible things, it's not at all hard to show that things are both like and unlike anything else you please. Now these visible things, I think about the sensible order, of course. Vision is one of our senses. And along with our senses, we almost intuitively understand difference and likeness. And that, again, these two tables that are in front of me, one is more for a particular purpose, but there is a shared unified purpose that they both participate in. They are meant to hold objects. One is meant to hold perhaps more general material, and the other is meant to hold objects for hosting, for writing, for reading. And surely, beginning with something that we understand well, like the sensible order, it gives us an intuitive understanding of likeness and unlike. Parmenides, "And you are quite right," he said, "but you must do the following in addition to that. If you want to be trained more thoroughly, you must not only hypothesize, if each thing is, and examine the consequences of that hypothesis. You must also hypothesize, if that same thing is not." So this brings back ideas about the null hypothesis in college. That while it's not necessarily an opposite statement, it is a statement of seemingly opposing quality to the one that is put forth. And so here we are being introduced to this process of learning and of self-mastery, of critical thinking, the rational experience of examining both the thing that we wish to be true the thing that is or we believe to be, and potentially the thing that is not, or the thing that we are concerned with potentially being untrue. That these practices, this procedure, is something by which we can understand more fully the object of our attention. What do you mean? Socrates asks. If you like, said Parmenides, take as an example this hypothesis that Zeno entertained. If many are, what must be the consequences, both for the many themselves in relation to themselves and in relation to the one, and for the one in relation to itself and in relation to the many? And in turn, on the hypothesis, if many are not, you must again examine what the consequences will be both for the one and for the many in relation to themselves and in relation to each other. And again in turn, if you hypothesize, if likeness is or if it is not, you must examine what the consequences will be on each hypothesis. For both the things hypothesized themselves and for the others, both in relation to themselves and in relation to each other. And the same method applies to unlike, to motion, to rest, to generation and destruction, and to being itself and not being. And in a word, concerning whatever you might ever hypothesize as being or as not being or as having any other property, you must examine the consequences for the thing you hypothesize in relation to itself and in relation to each one of the others, whichever you select, and in relation to several of them and to all of them in the same way. And, in turn, you must examine the others, both in relation to themselves and in relation to whatever other thing you selected on each occasion. Whether what you hypothesize as being or as not being. All this you must do if, after completing your training, you are to achieve a full view of the truth. So let's take this bit by bit. So now of this hypothesis that Zeno entertained, if many are, what must be the consequence for both the many themselves in relation to themselves and in relation to the one, and for the one in relation to itself and in relation to the many? So this is something that we've covered in a previous dialogue, in the dialogue of the sophist, but it'll be good to go over it again. And there's a lot of, I think, important things that are wound up in this, because finally now we're getting to the specifics of oneness and multiplicity. So we start out with an assertion. We say, if many are. What must be consequences both for the many themselves in relation to themselves? And I sort of want to go off script here a little bit and just think about the potential consequences and think about exactly what this means in more of a practical context. It can often be difficult to wrap the mind around terms such as many and oneness. But also, it's quite simple if we just sort of relax into it and we just sort of experience with our senses. The senses in general, we understand that there are many different sensory inputs that are occurring. Even in this quiet room that I find myself in, there are plenty of different things to pay attention to, many of them visual. Very little of them are auditory, but there are some auditory sounds in here. Auditory information, I should say. My voice being one. The subtle drone of the building that I'm in, some creaking. There's a water fountain that is running for my cat. I can barely hear it. I can see it more than I can hear it. And there's some faint noise from the street as the cars drive by. This is, in a sense, a multiplicity. There are many different things. None of these are, well, I shouldn't say none of these, but seemingly all of these are separate things. So what must be the consequences, both for the many themselves in relation to themselves and in relation to the one? So the many in relation to themselves, the first question I have is, well, what potential consequence are we concerned with? And I suppose it could be any general consequence. We're looking for a result. If I just think about what I put forward just now, I have to think that of the many, the consequence to themselves, I think, is number one, that their being is afforded by difference or non-being. Multiplicity of identity is possible. And so we have all of this unique information that we take in. Now, another potential consequence is that they're alienated from each other. Of course, they're related to each other, because they can't just be an isolated being in and of itself. Otherwise, they would be indistinct from each other. And we have some basic relationality that we can identify in any particular room. Like I can say, for example, my dining room table, all of the legs of the chairs and table is in contact with the one particular rug. All of my living room furniture is on another rug, and I have a front room that has another rug, and it has furniture on it. And so there are these separate things, but they are in contact. There is a relation. All of these different sections of the place that I live that work together to create a particular environment. And so the environment then becomes that unity that at least I consider. And so it's not so much about the material contacts as it is now a higher order, the intelligible order, what purpose they are serving, what they are participating in. And for the one in relation to itself, and in relation to the many. Well, we've discussed this potential for pluralism. That is the case where we can take a multiplicity and we can identify a unity that brings all of it together. So, for example, the material in my apartment here, it all comes together to produce this place that I call home, that I feel comfortable in. But it's not the only unity. If I were to take this unity and put it at the head of a company, for example, the company would fall apart, because the material and the environment of an apartment is not sufficient to lead a company. There has to be departments within a company. There has to be a building to house employees. There has to be a viable service and product that is offered to maintain all of this, and there has to be leadership at the top to cohere it all together. And so it can't be said that of multiplicity that unifies, that every single unification is going to carry over or be a supreme unification, for example. Now I could take a different type of unity on the one that we mentioned about the apartment. I could say that this apartment is one of, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, I suppose, in the building. And so if there are 8 in the building, then the building itself is another type of unity. And there are elements of unification of this building. There is a laundry room. There is a hallway, a communal hallway. and there is shared material approximations. And the building itself, it is lit, it is heated, and all of this contributes to its oneness. And the people here all come together to make their own spaces, not necessarily to participate with each other, but nonetheless we live in this building. So there's this unification on top of a unification. And there's a further multiplicity that we can imagine by this apartment building being in a series of apartment buildings within the entire complex that I live in. And the complex itself then has a management, a centralizing structure that is a unity. And so we have this interweaving multiplicity and unifications. But going back to reflect on Zeno's hypothesis, he says, or he asks, about the consequences for the one in relation to itself and in relation to the many. So of things as they move into multiplicity or in terms of unification, my mind goes to the intelligible order to see this, more so than it does the sensible order. I use the sensible order to build or to take in information to establish what these things are. But then the intelligible order comes in, and then I ask myself, okay, what is the purpose of these things? And it's the purpose that I find to be the thing that unifies or the thing that disassembles into multiplicity. And it is this purpose that is the reason for it. That brings a question in my mind: what is the role of material causes in this structure, in this framework? Well, almost like the forms themselves as something that are, that's something that is useful as a structure to see, that we see into the intelligible order. I think about the sensible in the same way, that the material and all of the causes, the physics and everything that underlies the sensible order is the basic structure, the basic framework. And that can be understood just as the intelligible domain, the formal domain, can be understood. But in the formal domain, what we are concerned with is, at least in part, the way in which multiplicity comes to unity, or the way in which unity dissolves into multiplicity. And we know all too well, being a materialistic culture, how the sensible order is understood. We understand things by experimentation, by measure, by test and retest, because it is by this environment that we are afforded information. We take in the senses from this world, and as we understand more, we integrate, and we then go back to the drawing board and consider and think about purposes. Now he continues, and in turn, on the hypothesis, if many are not. So I'll pause here for a second. From the sophist, we've answered this question, if many are not. It's a strange question to ask, I suppose. And there's a difference between that which is not, or non-being, and absence. Difference, I think, has a particularly interesting role to play here in this concept of that which is not. Difference is the thing that separates identities from each other. In a way, it breaks unification, but maybe break is not the right word. It gives color to identity itself. And while in some sense we can experience this color as a fracturing of identity, it is also something that allows us to see the parts of the unified whole. And again, as I've mentioned, it maintains the centralized identity of the parts themselves, not just of oneness. And so it allows for this dynamism of reality to emerge. You must again examine what the consequences will be both for the one and for the many in relation to themselves and in relation to each other. So consequences in relation to the self, I think, is interesting. Now, when we have a unified whole of something, and we ask ourselves, what is the consequence of trillions of cells participating together to produce a being? One of the potential consequences is self-awareness, consciousness. Another potential consequence is any set of behaviors. I'm looking at my cat right now eating out of his bowl. That's a unique set of characteristics that have emerged through the participation of parts. And there is a unity there, a unity that is different from mine. So again, you must again examine what the consequences will be both for the one and for the many in relation to themselves and in relation to each other. Now, when we think about the multiplicity and the relation between cells, for example, cells have purposes. They are in and of themselves unified identities. They have purposes, and they communicate in various ways to perform those purposes and to fulfill those purposes. And so the consequence of the multiplicity communicating with each other is sometimes good, sometimes in all cases in biological life it tends towards death, but also life and rebirth, transformation. And depending on what type of identity in question we're considering or discussing, this participation and the consequence of that participation can vary. Not all unities result in the central organism or the agentic part of the organism. There are many different organs that exist within the thing that we call the agent, where the mind is the driving force that moves all of the parts in one direction together. The organs themselves have an identity that are based on a multiplicity. He continues, and again, in turn, if you hypothesize if likeness is or if it is not, you must examine what the consequences will be on each hypothesis. So thinking about this hypothesis now, if likeness is or if it is not, there's a question to be had about considering a thing, if it is like one thing or if it is not like another thing, or the idea of likeness itself. Is it some one thing or is it not? Now here when I see the following, you must examine what the consequences will be on each hypothesis, both for the things hypothesized themselves and for the others, both in relation to themselves and in relation to each other. There's relatedness between the hypotheses that we've mentioned. It's not just two different examples. We could think about the one example, the likeness is or is not, and if many are or if they are not. And so almost in the same way as we consider the consequences of the multiplicity and the consequences of oneness within the multiplicity and also the multiplicity as it participates in oneness, considering all of these factors, it gives us a broad view of the question at hand. And the broad view is the thing that provides us, I think, seemingly with potential answers, but at the very least, a place to go, a place for the mind to go, and a place where the mind may use the sensible order to better understand the intelligible. And of course, vice versa is true. This network is a fascinating thing to reflect on. And the same method applies to unlike, to motion, to rest, to generation and destruction, and to being itself, and to not being. And in a word, concerning whatever you might ever hypothesize as being, as or not being, or as having any other property. You must examine the consequences for the thing you hypothesize in relation to itself, and in relation to each one of the others, whichever you select, and in relation to several of them, and to all of them in the same way. So relationality, as it always has been, is key. Okay, so today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. And so I figured I'd spend a little bit of time getting away from the specific interpretation of the hypotheses that are put forth, and rather reflect on the general sentiment of what Parmenides is getting at here. Now, initially, when I had read these first lines, I thought of the null hypothesis. So I want to go through the definition of this null hypothesis for further understanding of what it is and how it may relate or may not relate to what we are saying here. So, the null hypothesis is a statistical expression. The null hypothesis is a default assumption that there is no effect, no difference, or no relationship between variables. It is the hypothesis you assume to be true unless the evidence forces you to reject it. And in this way, you do not prove the null hypothesis to be true. You either fail to reject it or reject it based on the evidence. It exists to prevent confirmation bias, premature conclusions, mistaking noise for structure. We are forced to ask, with the null hypothesis, what would the world look like if the thing I suspect were not the case? And so I think that there are clear reasons how there is some overlap. And of course there's some clear reasons how this is not exactly what Parmenides is getting at. In our dialectic, we are after something that is exhaustive, not statistical. And so we need to understand our original inquiry, our original question, or our original hypothesis, but we also have to understand its negation and the consequences for both. But again, it's not a statistical probability. We're not asking how likely something is. We're thinking about what necessarily, logically, must follow if something is to be true. So I was always taught that this null hypothesis, it's not the opposite of your claim. It's rather that what you claim, and perhaps more specifically, within the way that you test what you claim, that given the evidence, the empirical evidence, there is no relationship between two variables. It perhaps doesn't even necessarily mean that the thing that you're after is proved false. Again, so it's not necessarily the opposite of the thing in question, but a very specific statistical statement about the relationship between variables. So I just wanted to get that out there for whatever reason. But the next thing to do, I suppose, would be to reflect, perhaps, in some capacity about the importance of thinking about the whole of things. When I think about my experience, and I think about my quickness to opinion and my excitable heart, the way in which it grabs at me and influences my reason, I know that there are plenty of things within my mind, within the failures of heart, that fail to be prudent. It fails to be complete. I don't want to say objective here because it's a subjective experience. There's often this character, the spirit, for which the refined and patient dialectic, this sort of internal dialectic, is thrown by the wayside in favor of something that is more expedient and fueled by the heart's desire. And of course, this is not something that leads to a productive experience. It's not something that leads to productive outcomes often. Now, it's one thing if one has a very good intuition about things and their heart is aligned. This sort of harmony is a wonderful thing. And it may happen, but eventually hot-headedness and egotistical expression will get the better of our reasoning, and it will fail us. And so I bring this up because within the broad picture that we are being exposed to here, that we are just about to get into, the importance of this, of analyzing not just what you wish to attend to, but those other aspects of what you wish to attend to that may be of the opposite, may be contrary to it. It is asking the questions, what if? What if this is the case? What will follow from that? How would I proceed in understanding then? And of late, in my prayers, I've been thinking about how to be better in traffic. And there really is no outburst per se. There's no physical change in the way that I drive, for the most part. When it comes to some dissatisfaction that occurs on the road, like if I'm cut off, or if somebody's driving too slowly, or somebody's driving erratically, whatever the case might be. What occurs is within my heart. And whether it be within my heart or it's brought into the world, I don't think there makes much difference. And it's this that I need to control. But it's the underlying structure, perhaps, the underlying disposition, that is certainly out of step with the type of sophistication that we are being asked of when we wish to put forth some hypothesis. And if I am to ask myself when I am driving in an instant, should I be feeling this way? Kind of a strange hypothesis. But in the consideration, if we desire to be more reserved in our thinking, and to think about where exactly to place violence, where to place anger, generally frustration, in the broader context of things, we have to see the relationship and the potential among these things. If we don't, we'll be left in this sort of infantile, emotional state with poor control. And of course, this sort of thing is unbecoming of an adult. And also, I should say that this translates into all facets. It's not just driving. There are many situations in which this can become an issue if it is not brought into a more sophisticated way of seeing and thinking about things. Now, Parmenides says, in a rather long-winded way, and the same method applies to unlike, to motion, to rest, to generation and destruction, and to being itself and not being. And in a word, concerning whatever you might ever hypothesize as being, or as not being, or as having any other property, you must examine the consequences for the thing you hypothesize in relation to itself and in relation to each of the others. Now, he's going to go on a few more lines here, but I think one can see both at the potential impracticality of this, but also in terms of an exercise. Now, I want to put a little caveat on this impracticality situation. When I say impractical, I don't necessarily mean that it wouldn't be something that one should or ought to integrate into their mental exercises, per se. I mean that within all things, within all considerations, having this sort of infinite centralization or first principles approach certainly works well to solve problems, but everything that we think about cannot be this elaborate, outstretched, philosophical reflection. And it's for this reason I feel as though there is a degree of impracticality. But certainly for myself, for the young Socrates, for anybody that wishes to be the best that they can be, they have to continually test themselves. And I think it's a measure by which one can participate with this system insofar as they can maintain a level head and not get lost in everything, still be able to participate in the light, jovial conversations. And in fact, now that this comes around again, I find it fascinating that this was brought up before. What the crowd calls idle talk. Now, this idle talk, I think there are plenty of reasons for it, but one is engagement. And another is levity. And together, the engagement with this levity, I think, creates a door through which we open, we naturally enter into it. And it's this reciprocal experience that we are afforded, ourselves and whoever is our interlocutor. So once again, we find ourselves with the instruction, you must examine the consequences for the thing you hypothesize in relation to itself. So let's do it again. The first thing that I want to think about is the word relation itself. So, from the Latin, we have relatio, meaning a bringing back, a referring, a connection, a report or account. Now the Latin verb root, referre, which is what relatio comes from. You have the prefix re, meaning back or again, and fere, to carry or to bear. So we have the meaning to carry something back, to bring something back, to refer one thing to another. So this is sort of the space that I think we have to be in when we think about relation, because we don't want to get stuck in a particular type of seeing relation. We don't necessarily want to see it in terms of dimensional qualities. Not saying that that's not useful, but for what we're after right now, it's not really all that useful. So focusing again on the origins, on the roots, to bring something back again. We can either think we're bringing something back to a place that it has been before, or we can think about it in the sense that we are bringing it back in relation to something that's of particular concern. I also have to wonder if these two are not the same thing or closely related. Now, taking the first, this idea again of bringing back again, when we think about, there's so many different types of relations out here in the world. And as I look in front of me, I see a series of books, the history of England. And in these books there are many relations. Even at this basic level, at which I just look at the cover of the book, I understand that there are plenty of relations that are going on there. The title, the author, the volume, all of this has certain relevances. When I think about what Parmenides says here, when he begins his instruction, he says, you must examine the consequences for the thing you hypothesize in relation to itself. I think about myself. I think about the relations that are within myself. I think about how complex they can be. How many times throughout the week I think to myself, is this the way that I should be relating? Is this the way that I should be behaving? Should I have done this in this situation? I examine these relations. I guess this goes a little bit outside of the self, of course, but it's a self-reflection at the very least. When I think of true self-relation, I think about the self as a unity, but then as a necessary consequence, what happens is I identify elements that have the capacity or the quality of being identified. They're differentiated by non-being. And although I started at a place of unity, now what I attempt to see is their difference, so I could better understand that unity. And so when I think about myself, I reflect on my behavior, I think about my heart, I think about where my desires are, I think about where my attention is, I think about the quality of my reasoning, I think about the intensity of my attention. I think about, and feel about the expression of myself as I fall into a type of passivity or dissociation. I think about how all of these parts are related to one another, and how at times they can be so disharmonious and at others harmonious. And my will, my attention has a massive amount to do with that. And I consider within this unity, if I could find a unity that is recognizable to myself, that orients me in my multiplicity, then I know I found something good. And of course, there is an underlying principle here, that order that I seek is not just any old order, because there are plenty of unities. I just mentioned that there are things that I'm dissatisfied about myself. There are things that I like, I suppose, too. But of those things that I think negatively of, there is a place, the place of relevance, for which I establish that dislike. And that place, I think, is something that can be refined. It is something that can be made better. A stronger relation to that thing, which of course is outside of the self. It can be found within experience. But all the same, whether it comes from the sensible world or of the intelligible, the order is there nonetheless. We find it either way. And I have to get away from separating these two orders too readily, because there is that relation, although we haven't discussed in particulars. And in the Sophists we've identified this pluralism. But sophistication is there to be had, and we will come back around to this and revisit it many times. You know, there's a certain irony when it comes to talking about the direction of things. And perhaps it's unavoidable that we use the language of direction in the intelligible sphere, or in the intelligible domain. Or perhaps just going off of what I said, direction is the right term to use. Now, not long earlier, there is this conversation about this, the potential for seeing the sensible world and the formal world, the discrepancy being that within the formal, or rather within the sensible, there is everything that we understand to be this mechanistic, or seemingly mechanistic, series of interactions and material causes. The issue comes in, of course, here again, so maybe this is where we start threading some relationships. And our use of these dimensions earlier seemed to be not the best way to pursue understanding the intelligible. Because if we do it by strict dimensional qualities, like if we were to measure the length of this rug, for example, we would come up with some number. But how do we measure the length of its value? That's something that's much more difficult. And of course, value on this scale seems to be quite minimal because it's what I value. It's maybe what we culturally value to a degree. I mentioned the rug because there's utility to us, regardless of what the pattern looks like. I happen to like the pattern, so there's an additional aesthetic quality to it. But we can see how these things come together to create something that is valuable within a certain network, the network being the collection of human minds. And I suppose, to break for a second, that there's also this worry about where this all amounts to. When we move into the intelligible and think about the length of or measuring the value of something, or establishing and identifying the purpose of something, perhaps there's an anxiety. I'm not sure if this is within me or I'm trying to find the other side of things consistent with what we've been talking about. But I have to imagine that there's a potential anxiety when it comes from the observations of what we have in front of us, and that's it. That is just this world, or this earth, and we know of other earthly bodies around us and other interesting material processes. We ourselves, we don't know of anything else that is outside of this, that lives within this framework. And seeing, as we do, as much as we can, the purpose among things here, and the order, and what we can see in the material world, and the security, the predictability of material causes. These questions about their ontological direction matter. I think they matter quite a bit. And it's difficult not to make an unsolicited claim about the hyperproductivity of all of this into a system or a structure that is truly encompassing of all things. I'm not saying that this doesn't exist. I am a Christian. But at the same time, this is something that needs to be arrived at. This is not something that can just sort of be stated as wanting. Even, I think, in regular discourse, I found that matters like this are difficult because people speak of them so flippantly. And especially since today we're not really one religion, we are sort of characters that are floating on peripheries of things, being taken over by others and spit out again by others. And so it's hard to get this mental frame right and the shared language right. It's easier when one believes in a similar direction, but when there's this multiplicity of belief, it increases the necessity. I think the necessity is always there, because it's a prudent thing. But nonetheless, in societies that are not as harmonious, there's less of this productive relations among the parts. And I think that this grasping of the broader unity of things is important, because at some point we will see a convergence, a strong convergence. And perhaps when we see them, we won't entirely be satisfied, but we'll see these almost like fingers in the sky, pointing at certain places. We find this, of course, within our observations of material causes. Now, perhaps just going off of what I said about this directionality, I think what we have here, at least in this way of considering things, is a chance and an opportunity to understand where things are pointing. And not just where, perhaps, because there's all sorts of things that participate in identities that are shallow and don't mean much. But if we take sort of an aggregate of conscious and aware identities and identities that are formed and far away from that consciousness, what does that mean? All of this sort of these interesting possibilities that do exist. I think drawing relationships between these is fundamental in the establishing, if it is possible, that ordered system of reality that we find ourselves in, that not only includes whatever this is right now, this agent that's reflecting on this experience, but also different agentic experiences that are living on perhaps material, perhaps formed of this relationship between the intelligible and the material. So in that way, it's sort of a relational being that sits on an interim, on an expanse, that just sort of, I'm not sure what language to use here, delegates or facilitates probably is the better way to go about it, especially after coming off the statesman and the observation of the weaver. The harmony and the maintenance of the harmony to avoid final collapse, I think, is the true part of the true. I think additionally there is this aspect of the creational quality, so it's not just the maintenance and the prevention of the final destruction, because of course there's all sorts of decay and endings in our reality, but there are also births and regenerations, and this creative process is a direction towards something. And this somethingness is a sure identity or identification of this creative power and potential. And by this direction, I think we should not get confused between the ups and the downs, the coming togethers and the disunities. We should not say that everything is going to fall into a disunity, even though we see disunities all around us. And I say that again because we have strong unities in existence. But I suppose that one can say, well, a unity happened from nothing. And of course this argument is nonsensical, because you can't have something from nothing. The only thing that you have from nothing, or non-being, which is not necessarily the same as nothing, but non-being, or no thing, I think it's a good way to say it, is if there is something, because nothing is the quality of that difference between identities. Now, moving forward into the sentence that we were at originally, he says, you must examine the consequences for the thing you hypothesize in relation to itself. Okay, so we talked about that. And in relation to each one of the others, which you select. So we've talked about this also to a degree, at least talked about it enough where it's an image in the mind rather than this sort of abstract word on a page situation. So I think we've run through a couple of different thought experiments at this point. We've gone through some examples of multiplicity and how at once it's easy to see from a thing of unity how there are parts participating in it, and by that we can see the multiplicity. We can see the difference between individual identities, and we could see multiplicity there. And it's through this establishment of some identity as the central source of attention, and then by differentiation or the queen's non-being, we find ourselves in understanding of this complex matrix of things, of reality, of being. And he goes on to say, Parmenides, that is, and in relation to several of them, and to all of them in the same way. So, he's speaking here, this conjures up images of a tree, in which there are these branches to this tree. And through these branches, we find more and more identities, I suppose, but also by exploring the relationships of all of these to themselves, to each other, we discover more complete this map of reality that includes both the formal causes, that of the intelligible cause, of the purposeful cause, and that of more of the material types of causes, or the what we would call material causes, I suppose, like our laws of physics and all of this. But let me try to put this in more sophisticated terms. The intelligible and the sensible. Again, I'm going to try to go through this exercise of relating them better. Before, I've given plenty of different ideas, I guess, or aspects of each domain, and listed characteristics that are specific to it. I can't remember if it was in this or in the last. But the point being, I still have that list. And so I'm going to be reflecting again on this. Now, when we consider the mode of being between these two orders, in the sensible domain, or what they refer to as belonging to us or of the particulars, we have the process of becoming. And I would also have to imagine that the opposite is true in this. If we were going to give it this characteristic, it's becoming, but also it's maybe not destruction, but it's undoing, unbecoming. And within the intelligible, we do have a grounding. We have something that is constant. We have being itself. A concept that is found in mind, but it is also a concept that is just found in base reality. That being is a principle of existence. And as long as something is, then we say that something is. It is within that intelligible category. Now this is separate of things that are coming into being, that are becoming, and that are undoing, separating, multiplying. This process is dynamic in my mind. And there are various things within this that hold it. There are various things that disperse it, I suppose. But all the same, this dynamism is operating on a structure of being. Where, in one hand, to handle the mutable and the changing of the sensible domain, we have an unchanging, stable, underlying order of being. While in multiplicity we can, or in plurality we can get lost in the many, in that which is poorly defined. the grounding of oneness, or of the structure of the existence of being, the unified being, the principle of unity. There is something that prevents against disunity, disharmony, or multiplicity from dissolving into complete idleness and absence, or what in the Old Testament we would call evil. But there is something that is non-spatial and non-temporal that gives rise to, or gives access for, a spatial and a temporal experience. And while information, I suppose from a conscious point of view, is through our senses, generally speaking, I think the participation of things, of all of that multiplicity, of all of the material interactions, of all of the things that are subject to this great change, there is something that, much like our own, an intellect that sees. Now this is where, again, I said a moment ago, if there wasn't a significant build to this, then it would be premature and lackluster. But here the the key thing to speak of is this concept of the intellect. We may define it as the capacity by which being is intelligible at all. So it may not be a thing among us, and not a mind necessarily thinking thoughts in time in a particular space. I suppose it might help us relate to it in that way. If there is a mind and thoughts that happen in space and time, then that's fine, but it would remain aspectual. It wouldn't be what the thing is at its core, I suppose. Reality without the intellect would not be something chaotic or multiplicitous. It would be indeterminate, not even chaos, but nothing articulate. Now this idea of capacity becomes central. And here it's important to note that capacity is something that does not require agency, whereas agency implies intention, deliberation, and choice. Capacity implies a structural possibility or aptitude. So when I take any particular being, and in the sophist, we come to understand that being is the capacity to affect or to be affected. We take any being, we take this table. We say that it has the capacity to hold the weight. It can be affected in that way. It can affect other things by holding them up. It can be affected by other things. But the table doesn't decide to hold it, but it's still participating in the intellect. It does not intend to function. But by being what it is, it can do what it is responsible for. Now Parmenides says, all this you must do if after completing your training you are to achieve a full view of the truth. So with this, I think I'm going to end this episode here and continue next time.